let's go back in time for a second. Picture this. It's 2 in the morning, January 5th, 1943. You're out in the middle of the South Pacific, and it is pitch black. You are Lieutenant Russell Cochran. You're on the deck of the USS Helena, and you're staring into the darkness, trying to track a Japanese dive bomber that is just screaming out of the moonlight, coming right for you. The order is given, you fire. And what happens next? Well, it changes everything.
Cochran just watches, completely stunned. The plane doesn't get hit, not in the traditional sense. It doesn't swerve or pull up. It just evaporates. 1 second, it's a deadly threat, and the next, it's a cloud of fire and metal falling into the ocean. The shell he fired never even made contact. He's just witnessed the very first ghost kill of the war, executed with a weapon so top secret that even the guy who fired it didn't know exactly what it could do. And just like that, Cochran is left staring at an empty sky, trying to figure out what in the world he just saw.
And that right there is the big question we're tackling today. How is that even possible? The answer isn't just some cool piece of military history. It's the story of a technological miracle that was born out of sheer desperation. It was forged to fight one of the most terrifying weapons ever dreamed up. So to really understand the solution, you have to first understand the nightmare of a problem that made it so necessary.
So by late 1944, the war in the Pacific, it had become a really grim math problem for Japan. They were losing planes and experienced pilots way faster than they could replace them. Meanwhile, the American industrial machine was just cranking out ships and planes at a rate that was impossible to keep up with. They needed something new, a weapon so radical, so terrifying, it would completely rewrite the rules of naval combat. This is it. This is the birth of the Kamikaze, the divine wind. And when Vice Admiral Onishi says this, he's not being poetic. He's being cold, brutally logical. See, a normal bomber pilot had maybe a 10% chance of hitting a warship that's moving and shooting back. But a piloted missile? A human-guided bomb? Onishi calculated that could get a 50% hit rate. For the pilots, it was the ultimate sacrifice. For the admirals, it was a terrible, but in their minds, necessary trade. One pilot, one plane, for one massive American warship.
For the American sailors, this was just pure horror. This quote from a top Navy commander really gets to the heart of the psychological shock. I mean, how do you fight an enemy that has no intention of surviving the battle? An enemy whose own death is the weapon. All of a sudden, every defensive system they had, which were all designed to shoot down planes that wanted to drop their bombs and fly home, seemed completely, tragically useless.
And this chart really breaks down why those defenses were failing so badly. Your long-range 5-inch guns, they used these mechanical timers. Gunners had to literally guess where a plane was going to be several seconds in the future. Now, against a slow, steady bomber, that's already tough. But against a kamikaze diving at 400 miles an hour, as one gunner put it, it was like fighting geometry with arithmetic. The math just wasn't on their side. And the closer-in guns, the Bofors and the Olicons, they needed a direct hit. But even when they got one, the plane's momentum just carried the wreckage right into the ship anyway. You could shred a wing, but you couldn't stop a ton of burning metal and fuel that was still being aimed by a pilot. So the Navy had a problem that you couldn't solve with just bigger guns or more bullets. They didn't need a stronger bullet. They needed a smarter one. They needed to figure out the secret behind that ghost kill from 1943. And the solution, as it turned out, was hidden right inside the shell itself. The answer was a piece of tech so secret it was hidden behind the codename VT, which stood for variable time. It was called the proximity fuse. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a fuse. It was a tiny, self-contained radar station packed into the tip of a shell. It didn't need to hit the target. It just needed to get close. This thing turned every near miss into a kill. But actually building it was thought to be borderline impossible.
Just let that number sink in for a moment. 20,000. G's. That's 20,000 times the force of gravity. That is the insane force that the tiny, delicate electronics inside this fuse had to survive the exact moment the gun fired. We're talking about vacuum tubes no bigger than a grain of rice, originally made for hearing aids. It was an engineering problem right up there with the Manhattan Project. They essentially had to build a radio that was also a cannonball. So, how did this impossible device actually work? Well, it was brilliant in its simplicity. As the shell flies through the air, it's sending out a constant radio wave. Think of it like a train whistle. You know how the pitch gets higher as the train gets closer? The fuse was listening for that same kind of change in its own radio waves bouncing off the enemy plane. It's called the Doppler shift.
When the signal coming back got strong enough and that pitch changed fast enough, the fuse knew it was within about 70 feet of the target. And at that exact perfect moment, bam, it detonates, creating this expanding wall of shrapnel moving faster than the speed of sound that would just shred any aircraft that flew into it. The fuse worked beautifully in tests, but its real history-changing moment would come in the spring of 1945, during the absolute bloodiest naval battle of the entire Pacific War, the invasion of Okinawa. This is where the theory would meet the brutal reality of thousands of kamikazes. This number gives you an idea of the scale of Japan's last desperate roll of the dice. Almost 2,000 kamikaze missions were flown against the American fleet in just 3 months. This wasn't just a series of attacks. It was an overwhelming, relentless storm of guided missiles, all aimed at one thing: sinking the invasion fleet and forcing America to retreat. And the effect of the fuse was, well, just look at these numbers. It was immediate and absolutely staggering. Before the proximity fuse was widely used, kamikazes had a terrifyingly high success rate, almost 29%. Think about that. Nearly 1 in every 3 attackers hit their target. But as soon as the fleet was armed with these new shells, the hit rate plummets to under 10%, and by the end of the war, it's less than 3%. This wasn't a small improvement. This was a revolution in air defense. The fuse made American anti-aircraft fire 7 times more effective, practically overnight. This quote comes from the captain of the USS Helena, a destroyer that became a legend after it survived 22 separate kamikaze attacks in just over an hour. And his words really capture what it was like to witness this. The planes didn't just get shot down, they disappeared. They were disintegrated by these invisible walls of steel. For the sailors on those ships who had felt so helpless for so long, it must have looked like an absolute miracle. Now, imagine what this looked like from the other side. For the Japanese pilots, it must have been completely baffling. They're flying through what they think is normal anti-aircraft fire, and then suddenly their wingman's plane just explodes in midair for no apparent reason. The technology was so far beyond anything they had that their explanations started to sound like something out of science fiction. Invisible wires strung up between ships, floating aerial mines, even theories about American psychic powers. It was technological shock and awe on a scale they couldn't even comprehend. So the proximity fuse did a lot more than just win a single battle. It fundamentally changed the strategic math of the entire war. And in doing so, it forged a legacy that, kind of surprisingly, affects every single one of us even today. The military success was obvious, but the economic side of it was just as jaw-dropping. The whole program cost about $1.2 billion in today's money, but the estimates are that it saved over $10 billion in ships and personnel costs. That is an 8-to-1 return on investment. It was the ultimate proof of a key principle of modern warfare. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't more brute force, it's smarter technology. But the real payoff wasn't about money. It was about lives. U.S. military planners were getting ready for the invasion of mainland Japan, Operation Downfall. They were expecting an absolute bloodbath, with predictions of over 100,000 casualties from kamikaze attacks alone before a single soldier even stepped on the beach. By taking that threat off the table, the proximity fuse made a conventional invasion survivable. And while it was the atomic bombs that ultimately ended the war, this fuse is what made the alternative, a victory without such catastrophic losses, even possible. The program basically wrote the playbook for how we think about military tech today. The idea that making technology smaller actually makes it more powerful, that started here. Proving that being able to mass-produce complex tech is just as important as inventing it, done here. The whole concept of taking different existing parts, a radio, a battery, a fuse, and integrating them into a system that's way more powerful than the sum of its parts, that was defined here. And maybe most importantly, the idea that automating those split-second combat decisions can save human lives, that is the core legacy of the proximity fuse. And here's the kicker. As Dr. James Van Allen, one of the key scientists on the project, put it, this whole thing was the Manhattan Project of electronics. All the techniques they had to invent to mass-produce these tiny, rugged electronic parts, things like advanced quality control, microscopic soldering, shockproofing, they didn't just vanish after the war. They became the foundation for the entire modern electronics industry. That phone in your hand, the computer you're watching this on, its technological DNA traces right back to the secret weapon from World War II. So we end on this thought. The kamikaze was the ultimate weaponization of human will and sacrifice. And the proximity fuse was its perfect technological counter, a weapon that made that incredible sacrifice tragically irrelevant. It was a war of fanaticism versus physics, and Physics 1. And that leaves us with a question that we are still dealing with today. What happens to the nature of war when a nation's greatest weapon is no longer the courage of its people, but the brilliance of its machines?